I wanted to make a show that I would learn something from, that would answer questions that I didn't know the answer to ask my guests to try to answer questions that nobody knows the answer to, because that's the cutting edge, right? Getting information from our show that they can't get anywhere else. My aim has been to produce a show that will influence the influencers, and that is what I mean by leverage.
Hey, welcome back, Solar Warriors, to another episode of SunCast. If you're new here, I just want to say welcome in. Thank you so much for giving us the only non-renewable resource you've got. That, of course, is your time. The only thing, in addition, I'm going to ask you to pay today is attention, and pay attention you will. If you are unfamiliar with the broader conversation around energy transition, well, you are lucky that you picked this episode of SunCast to listen to. But of course, I guess many of you are listening because you saw the title and you want to hear the thoughts of today's guest. Today's entrepreneur is an energy analyst and a consultant who's written about energy and investing for more than a decade. His work, and indeed his voice, is no doubt well known among SunCast listeners, as he's become one of the leading podcasters in the climate tech and energy transition sector. I would say that he's helped define, quite literally, the term energy transition through his Energy Transition Show podcast. Chris Nelder is the author of books on peak oil and renewables investing. He's published more than 200 articles as a professional analyst and journalist, but his podcast now has more than 200 episodes that I think you should definitely be tuning into. Chris rarely, though, has had the microphone turned on him. So many of you probably know very little about his 7 different careers, like being a solar photovoltaic system engineer, and a software engineer and director of product development, an early web entrepreneur and a technical writer. So after quite literally years of persistence, Chris has finally dropped his defenses. He's agreed to join me for a deep dive into his background, what drives him, where he sees this all heading, and more about why he does what he does. I'm so excited to have the honor, and I'm grateful that you are joining us as well. I promise you will get a return on this investment. I also hope that you'll subscribe to the show. That'll ensure that you won't miss out on the twice-weekly contents we have just like this. Practical, tactical advice on how to build a career with meaning, how to help us in this energy transition, how to find your place in this world that we call renewables and clean energy. Of course, we've got nearly 700 episodes in the back catalog of clean energy founders, stories, and startup advice at mysuncast.com. But for now, let's dig into what you came here for. Let's get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune into another powerful conversation here on SunCast. Well, at long last, I finally get the pleasure and honor of saying welcome to SunCast, Chris Nelder.
Thanks, Nico. we have been, sort of dancing around this for quite a long time, some years. So I'm glad we finally had a chance to get together and do a conversation.
As am I. It's hard to nail down the only peripatetic professional podcaster in the clean energy space to have time to join me on the show. I thought I'd throw that word in there before you get a chance to do so. You can define it for us, however, because I want to start out the way that I typically start out, because you shared something with me that I've actually gone and shared with others. And it's a quote that just kind of rocked me when you shared it. So instead of me sharing a quote, I would love for you to share the quote that you did in one of our previous calls on commitment. And we'll dig in a little bit later on why that's so profound and impactful for you. But would you share that with us to start out?
Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents, meetings, and material assistance, which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do, or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now. William Hutchison Murray.
And so with that in context, you have shared from the pulpit, I'll say, from the podcaster's chair several times, that you're trying to mobilize an army. How do you describe then the problem you're trying to solve in this current phase of your career?
Yeah, that is my intention with the podcast, is to mobilize an army. what we're talking about here with the energy transition is, without overstating it, really nothing less than a fundamental reorganization of all human life support systems, right? Globally. It's an enormous task. It takes, in one way or another, sort of the willing participation of pretty much every human on Earth. And so we need a lot of people to help make this energy transition work. And it's complicated by the fact that there's a lot of people who don't want to see the energy transition work because they stand to lose from it. And so we need not only a lot of people to work proactively on the energy transition, we need a lot of people to play defense against those forces who want to stop or stymie or undermine the energy transition. So we're talking about a lot of people. It's a global army that we need, really. And so my intention with the podcast has been to try to bring them the best information that I can bring them, the most thoroughly researched, thoughtfully structured, heavily contemplated material, cutting edge thoughts that will help them be effective in their own work and in support of the energy transition. And I got to say, it seems to be working because we've gotten over the years, I mean, we've been doing the podcast for over 8 years now. We've gotten so many emails from our listeners and our subscribers telling us about how the show has influenced them, about how what they learned on the show was useful to them, or how they've applied it in their own lives to change their own lifestyles, or the ways that they consume energy personally, or to influence their workplaces and their employers or their towns, or to change careers. I mean, a lot of people have written to me to say, I've been an accountant for the last 30 years, and I wanted to do something proactive and helpful with the energy transition. And I started listening to your show and I learned all these things. And then I went and whatever they did, they switched careers. They started working on, some element of the problem in their own lives or in their own communities. So it seems to be working.
Many folks never get that level of such meaningful, deep feedback that the work you're doing is having an impact. I would love if you could maybe share a story that someone has given you direct feedback where your certain energy transition show as a product, something that you've invested, you've breathed life into, has directly changed their life. Maybe give us an example of that.
Wow, there's actually quite a few I could choose, but I guess the one that first comes to mind for me is there's an energy analyst. I don't have permission to tell her story or her name or where she works, so I won't reveal any of that. But she had a terrible accident where she was struck in the head by a train, and she got a terrible concussion and was, knocked off her feet and thrown several feet. And she had a terrible concussion for a year that made it impossible for her to work. And so she couldn't write, she couldn't really read, but the one thing she could do was listen. And so for that year that she was recovering, she told me she listened to every episode of the podcast, which is it's quite a commitment. I mean, yeah. I haven't tried to add it up lately. It's probably well over 300 hours of material. And she said that listening to the show helped her stay, current with the dialogue and what's happening in the energy transition, to keep her skills sharp mentally in terms of her understanding of, the content, the material. And also she felt like just sort of the sound of my voice was soothing in some way and helped her to recover. And she went out of her way to tell me the story, and it really touched me. So maybe that's why it sticks out.
I love that. I just did the math, and on 218 episodes, assuming they're each about 90 minutes, which you say they are, that's 333 hours.
Yeah, and there are some episodes in there that are less than 90 minutes and some that are a lot more, and then there's some that aren't even in the formal numbered sequence. So yeah, in that area.
That's amazing, over 300 hours of content. I had someone early in the SunCast canon, I think from when we were around 200 or so episodes, I was celebrating, I think, episode 200, and they said, "Did you know that you could listen to SunCast driving across the country nonstop from New York to LA and back. I thought I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but that's great to know. Oh, I feel like you're locked in the car with Nico. That I think that there's a lot of folks listening that would feel like they'd love to be locked in the car with you for that long because you've got such a deep experience. And in that regard, I wanted to ask you not how your show has changed the lives of others, but how the show has changed your life. Could you reflect a bit on maybe specifically how it's changed your life and even maybe intellectually ways that you've changed your perspective because you've had such intellectually stimulating conversations with folks that you respect?
Well, there's a lot to talk about there. I mean, I guess, well, to the first question, how has it changed my life? It's been an absolutely massive change in my life. I mean, for one thing, it enabled me to finally get to a point that I'd wanted to get to all my career, which was to have a stable income and a real business that supports me full time, my own business. So it's done that. And that's been amazing for me. It's given me a lot of freedom to pursue the ideas that I think are the most important ideas. And one of the great privileges of having a subscription supported show with no sponsors, no advertisers, no investors, no parent company, no media organization behind us, nobody except my business partner and our listeners to answer to, gives me the enormous privilege and freedom to say what I think is important and to just say what's on my mind. I mean, not too many people actually just get to say what they think at work. So that's been a really liberating part of all of this. And also, it's given me the ability to, make my lifestyle more flexible. So as you mentioned a little bit ago, I am a full-time peripatetic podcaster. I think I'm the peripatetic means someone who travels constantly, who's just always on the move. You could think like an itinerant preacher or something like that, right?
Yep.
The fact that I can live mobile has been an interesting evolution. So I just made that move not quite 3 years ago, about 2.5 years ago. I became fully mobile, and I've just been living in Airbnbs and or staying with at my family's cabin or whatever since then. And that's been a pretty amazing experience too. It's to not be weighted down with all of my stuff, which is still sitting in a storage unit somewhere near the Denver airport. Haven't seen it in almost 3 years, and just have the ability to go wherever and meet whoever and tell whatever stories I think are out there to tell. Of course, that makes it sound a lot easier than it is. It's actually logistically very difficult and complicated in many ways to live this way, and that has proved challenging, but I'm so glad that I've had the opportunity and that I've been able to pull it off. So that's how it's affected me personally. It's been hugely rewarding to do this career. I mean, like I said, we get lots of email from our listeners telling us how much the show means to them and how they've used it and applied it in their own personal lives, which is, every time I get an email like that, it just warms my heart like you can't even believe. So talking to so many people who know more than I do and who are smarter than I am about all sorts of things has really influenced the way that I think about a lot of stuff. Sometimes you'll hear me say it on the show, saying, "Wow, I came into this conversation thinking X, and you've changed my mind, and now I think Y." So that's a really fun part of it, actually, for me. I love when somebody can convince me to that I was wrong or to change my perspective on something. That's a really fun part of this gig, actually.
Is there any example that stands out for you where you've been convinced of something that you came in kind of not believing?
Okay, one that does come to mind for me is about a year ago, we had Jigger Shah on the show, and we talked about VPPs. And I went into that conversation fixated, as I had been for a very long time, on what it would take to enable like a fully distributed, fully retail instance of a VPP, right? So every household, for example, could control their appliances and participate in some sort of a reward-based or compensation-based scheme with their local utility. And that would depend on some sort of a tariff. And that would be a direct, like, consumer to utility type of transaction. And there's a lot of other ways to construe what a VPP is. There's a lot of other ways to build one. There's, in fact, none of the VPPs almost work the way that I just said. Most of the stuff that's actually out there consists of, an aggregator controlling lots of, oftentimes, largely identical appliances in concert, and then bidding that service into a structured wholesale market. So they're not even working with the local utility. It's not even a distribution level type transaction, and there's no tariff at the retail level that's involved. Stuff like that, and Jigger, with his perspective, which is, I think, largely sort of industrial in nature at this point, because he talks to a lot of people that are in the business who are, standing up different parts of the VPP sector, for example. They have different ways of approaching this opportunity, and his view was, you know what, if we can get all sorts of aggregators working to do this sort of thing at a high level, even if it all gets bid into structured wholesale market, at the end of the day, you kind of almost get the same result. Like, the VPPs have the same sort of impact on the system in terms of, the energy flow and the dynamism of the grid, which, I took his point on that. I was like, well, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but, you're right. Now, I do still understand and believe that there are lots of benefits that would be available with a VPP type implementation that really does happen at the distribution level, consisting of transactions between customers and their distribution utilities. And I do think that there's still a lot of opportunity there that's important to unlock. But Jigger convinced me that there are other approaches to the problem that can also get a lot done.
I think it's fascinating the way we, as hosts of these conversations, can, the goal is to help the listener learn and to also share bright minds that we have access to that perhaps they don't have access to. I think one of the things that you shared with me that I hadn't really put into words was this concept of leverage. Could you explain the power of the leverage of the podcast to achieve this mobilization of an army, the way that you see it in the show?
So I'm going to answer that question by starting with a point that I think sort of rankled you in one of our earlier conversations, where
Totally
I had characterized the product that we produce as prime rib, and that a lot of the stuff that was also being produced in the sort of energy and climate podcast sector was more like popcorn. And because we try very hard to produce a very thoroughly contemplated, highly structured, deeply researched, pre-scripted, in many ways, conversation, that helps us produce this very meaty sort of information dense, rich product. And the reason we do that, instead of just getting somebody on the phone and having a breezy conversation with no particular, pre-contemplation or not much more than a few bullet points to go by, is because I wanted to make a podcast that I wanted to listen to. I was very dissatisfied with the energy and climate podcasts that were available, 8 years ago, which is a significantly smaller population of podcasts than exists today. That's for sure. There's a lot more quality podcasts out there now about energy and climate, but I wanted to make a show that I would learn something from. I wanted to make a show that would answer questions that I didn't know the answer to. I wanted to ask my guests to try to answer questions that nobody knows the answer to, because that's the cutting edge, right? That's where you're getting somewhere. And so because we've done a show like that, because we've produced this prime rib product, we're attracting an audience that's willing to pay. Again, it's a subscriber show. It's not free to listen to. They're willing to pay for a very high quality, highly structured, thoroughly researched product. And the reason they're doing that is because they're getting information from our show that they can't get anywhere else. Like they're all going to learn something, even if they're practitioners. And many of our listeners are practitioners. They're people who are actively working in the energy transition sector, or they're entrepreneurs of various kinds in the sector. And so my aim has been to produce a show that will influence the influencers, as it were. And that is what I mean by leverage. If I just wanted to, get individuals interested in the energy transition, then I would have to do the kind of show that I think a lot of those popcorn shows out there do. It's like our shows all have a geek rating of 0 to 10. And that's my subjective evaluation of how esoteric the material is. It's not really about how good the interview was, or how good the interviewee was, or anything like that. It's more just
or even
about
how smart you need to be to understand it.
Yeah, it's not that either. Yeah, it's just more like, how rare is this information? How much of a knowledge base do you have to even understand this conversation, right? And so by producing high geek level or high geek rating shows, we're getting people who are interested in those shows. And that way we can actually influence the influencers. If we were going to take the route that everybody else and most everybody else takes, producing what I would consider a geek rating 0 or geek rating 1 kind of a show, which is aimed at people who, are probably mainly there for entertainment more than anything. They're not really trying to learn something necessarily about the energy transition. Then I would be convincing people or teaching people or getting people interested one at a time. But by influencing the influencers, by producing shows with high geek ratings, attacking questions that nobody knows the answer to, talking to the very best people that I can get to come on the show and talk with me, we're trying to constantly push the envelope, ask the difficult questions, make real headway on those questions. And that's how I'm influencing the influencers. And those people are sometimes influencing influencers themselves. So for every subscriber who's actually paying to listen to our show and listen to a very high level conversation with somebody who really knows their stuff, I hope that ultimately that means I'm influencing, maybe 10x that number of people.
Yeah. You use influence the influencers, and it is exactly that capacity to reach the hard to reach people who don't have time for filtering through the wheat and the chaff. I think that you've found your audience. They're not looking by and large for entertainment, and you leverage that network effect by reaching the folks inside the organizations, like the utilities, like the C-suite of companies, like the upper echelon of academia that themselves are passing along information and as required reading in many cases. I'd like to understand from that perspective, to the extent that you've been able to glean, what's the makeup of the audience? Who's bought in on this idea and is looking for the prime rib that's worthy of subscribing?
That's a really hard question to answer. In fact, before we started the show, I talked to a number of people who have expertise in marketing and producing media and that kind of thing. And they all wanted me to define, the audience that I'm going after. And I was like, you know what? I just have no idea. I just know that I want to make a show that I want to listen to. So maybe the answer is people like me, kind of. Well, what we know, and it's hard to know that much about your subscribers, right? I mean, in our case, we actually know quite a lot about our subscribers relative to most other podcasts because we are a subscription-based product. So we actually have their emails and we know who they are, and they've submitted a credit card number, which obviously we don't keep on file, Stripe handles all that stuff, but we do have some direct interaction with all of our subscribers, and we do ask them questions about, who they are. And we occasionally send out a survey saying, what about the show is working for you or not working for you, or, how is this relevant to you? And what we've gained from that information is that our subscribers are they almost defy description. I mean, it's just all over the place. We have listeners in 47 countries. We have CEOs who, are in the solar business. And, I got an email one time from a mendicant monk living in a forest in Sri Lanka who was somehow listening to the show. I have no idea how that works, but, it's really a very broad group of people from all different careers and backgrounds and all over the world. And I think the one thing that binds them all together is that they're truly, deeply, passionately interested in the energy transition, and they want to be able to apply what they've learned on our show. They're not just here for entertainment. And, sometimes I say that our show is a eat your peas show. It's not dessert. It's the thing on the plate that you don't want to eat half the time, but it's good for you. And that's so. Who are our listeners? There are people who are willing to pay to eat their peas.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. I love that context. In the outset, I said that I feel like you've quite literally defined the energy transition. But for those listeners who maybe this is the first time they've had someone with the capacity to address that, would you take a stab at defining what is the energy transition and how is that characterized?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of variation to the answer on that, depending on who you're asking. My answer is it's basically about transitioning away from fossil fuels and replacing them with renewables. Now, there's a lot of people who would object to that last bit and say, well, no, you're actually having to replace it with clean substitutes or clean, firm substitutes. That's something that a lot of nuclear proponents, for example, have tried to define it that way. I don't say that because I don't think that any of the alternatives beyond renewables are actually going to be viable players at scale in the energy transition. I think it's really, at the end of the day, it's pretty much about renewables. There might be a 10% slice that's not that renewable, that is clean, but by and large, it's about replacing fossil fuels with renewables. And that's just on the supply side. And then on the demand side, you have to change everything there too, right? So you have to switch from an internal combustion engine to an EV. You have to switch from an oil or a gas-fired heating and cooling appliance in your house to a heat pump running on clean electricity, and so on. And that happens all across the whole global human economy. I mean, it's just every imaginable kind of device that uses electricity or some other form of energy, right? And so that's how I think of it. There are a lot of variations on that. I've certainly seen, especially in the last couple of years, a number of players in the oil and gas sector trying to co-opt the term and say that they're participating in the energy transition, or launching their own podcast called Energy Transition something or other, which is hilarious to me because you listen to what they're talking about and it's not about the energy transition at all. It's just them trying to co-opt the term. But yeah, I guess I would say that it's really about transitioning away from fossil fuels and onto renewables. And the reason that we're doing that is because of climate change, right? So that's the objective. You may be right that we've helped define the energy transition. I mean, I looked back. Actually, there's an investor who's been involved in this space for a long time, since Cleantech 1.0, named Neil Dykman, who I've known for a long time. I knew you were going to
say Neil. That's so funny. Yeah.
And Neil reached out to me, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and asked me when the term energy transition started, and if we were the first to use it. And I went back and I looked through my archive of published articles and stuff, and yeah, we started using it right around the time that I think it was around the time that anybody started using it. I mean, I found a few instances from Green Tech Media where they were using the term right around the same time as we were. But that was sort of about it. And when my business partner Justin and I decided to start the show and we were trying to figure out what to name it, we had obviously a long list of candidate names. Anyone who's ever been in a band knows what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you what's the one you almost named it but didn't.
Well, anyway, we wound up with the Energy Transition Show because I wanted to just make it plain and simple and it is what it says on the tin. I think that's been a good choice because as it's turned out, the world has started to use that term. When we chose to call the show that, it was kind of an outlier. It was like, do people really know what that means? And nobody's really calling it that. And I was like, no, I'm sure that's the way the world is going. I'm sure that's what this show is going to be about. Let's call it the Energy Transition Show and just put a stake in the ground. And yeah, I'm happy we made that decision.
Could have been Energy Cocktail.
It could have been.
Well, one of the things that I think is a really important piece here, and I know at the risk, I want to state for the record that Chris and I've jousted a lot on this topic of prime rib and popcorn, and I actually believe that there is a lot of room for entertainment and that it attracts a broader audience. A great example of that is I was on the phone with someone earlier today who just left a job at Wayfair, and along the way he put 10 kilowatts on both of his houses, and he is genuinely trying to figure out how to start a solar development business. And he said to me, he's like, I'm trying to figure out how I haven't come across SunCast yet. And he had just come across it in the last 2-3 months. And I get stories like that a lot, Chris, that for me, I believe that I'm somewhere between popcorn and prime rib because we do serve a different audience. And I think that that's a really good thing. And as I've shared with you, I've, in many ways, as my colleagues, depended on the Energy Transition Show as a through line. When someone asks me, what should I listen to if I really want to understand the fundamentals, the physics, like how does this all work? There's one show I refer them to, and it's yours.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, I had countless, truly countless. It's easily dozens of people who've messaged me and said, hey, I'm subscribed, paying money on a monthly basis to this guy, Chris Nelder. Why aren't you charging? Why don't you have a Patreon? Why aren't you doing a subscription? I would pay you. And that's flattering. Candidly, I've said this to you privately, but you had the courage to do it, and I didn't. And I'm grateful that we've both carved out our lane, and we're both two real examples in a small pool of professional podcasters that are bringing this kind of information to the world. So I'm grateful for that. One thing that sort of characterizes the definition of energy transition for you is that it is by nature a movement from fossil to renewable. And even that term, renewables, is oft debated and it's co-opted, et cetera. How do you then, Chris Nelder, with decades of experience in the energy sector, how do you define renewables?
That is indeed a fraught term. Look no further than the headlines we've seen in the last day or two about people getting very unhappy with the fact that Drax, a major utility in the UK, is burning wood pellets produced from wood grown in Canada, and some of that's coming from old growth forests or forests that aren't supposed to be logged. And so there's a very vigorous debate right now about that particular instance and whether using trees grown in Canada this way to produce power in the UK is a legitimate, quote unquote, renewable approach. There's, the reality is that no energy source is perfect.
Or permanent.
Yeah. There's pluses and minuses with everything that you could try. And purity is not really the objective. What you want to do is get the best result you can with the least amount of damage, right? And so I'm not even sure the word renewable is uh, really the right descriptor. It's been around for a very long time, since the 60s or 70s anyway, in terms of the way that people think about energy systems. And so that's been, I think, almost just sort of a term of art that's kind of stuck. But whether that's the best way to describe what we're trying to do, I don't know.
As a fellow podcaster, one of the things that I know is a tremendously difficult process is, ultimately you produce one show a week. That's the goal. That's the commitment. That's the consistency that delivers that prime rib, which means you have 52 shots to get it, I'll quote in air quotes, right.
Actually, our show goes every 2 weeks, so 26
Every
episodes a
2
year.
weeks.
Yeah, it's
So
a
less than that.
bi-weekly show. 26 shows a year.
Got it. So 26 guests a year, which begs the question, in an effort to influence the influencers and mobilize an army, with 26, I'll call it bullets in the chamber, or 26 sort of opportunities to throw the line out. How do you decide the topic and the guest for each show?
Well, I've been asked this question a few times, and I'm afraid the answer is not very glamorous. A lot of times I'm just sort of following my gut, honestly. Now, I've been keeping a document of potential future show topics, either things that have occurred to me or, just bits of things that I've come across and said, well, one day maybe I want to do a show about this, and, make a note to myself and save a URL to some article or whatever. And of course, we get lots of suggestions sent in by our listeners, and I dutifully copy them all into this file. And so that file is now, I don't even know, it's over 300 pages.
Wow.
There are
300 topics or pages?
Pages.
Whoa. Because you write down notes on the topic.
Yeah. So there's probably 1,000 topics in there that I've made notes on and thought about. And oftentimes when I'm choosing my next guest or trying to come up with my next topic, I don't even look at that file.
I bet. For me, that would represent like the waste bin where I put ideas so that I can get them out of my head. But that's
well, oftentimes what happens is I'll put something in there and I'll make a few notes, and then like 2 years later, for whatever reason, I'll come back to the topic and I will actually go start developing it, and then I'll look back into that file and go, oh, I actually made a note about this. I totally forgot about that. And there'll be a couple of additional references there that I can throw into my research mix. But I just actually encountered this problem yesterday because I was trying to figure out who my next guests are going to be. And I went over that list, and especially the ideas that had come up for the past, couple of months that I thought were sort of top of mind or top of list, or things that my business partner thought would be great to do shows about. And I didn't like them. I just didn't like them. I wasn't feeling it. And I just kind of wandered around and spaced out and let my mind wander for a bit. And eventually, a couple of ideas came to mind, and by the end of the day, I had sent out and pretty much secured the next 3 interviews. But it just kind of came in a burst like that. And sometimes I have to think about, if I have a conversation with this person about this topic, how does that relate to the last show that we did, or is there continuity there with some of the previous shows that I want to highlight, and that kind of thing. But a lot of times I'm just sort of following my gut, to be honest.
Following your gut, your intuition led you to leave your role at Rocky Mountain Institute and pursue this full time, and become the peripatetic podcaster that now you are able to hang your hat on, and that is something that was a lifelong goal, I'd say, achievement for you as well. And that has taken you to the place where you can, like I often try to do as well, travel to do in-person events. And since I know that you're not the type to post on Instagram or other social media outlets where you've been and who you're hanging out with, I would say that Roundly character is not your sort of character. Other folks don't get to see, like, oh, you were traveling in France or wherever. So I'm curious if there are particularly interesting in hindsight, retrospect, over the last 2 or 3 years of now that you've been traveling, particularly interesting in-person interviews that this job has afforded you that are memorable for you and you never really shared with others?
The one that leaps to mind is episode 212, which we did last fall, which is about a tiny little island off the west coast of Scotland called Egg. And they did their own little energy transition. They did not have grid power, and they were basically living decades behind the rest of the world. Most of them, if they had any electricity at all, it was because they had their own little nasty little diesel generator, which was very expensive to run, and it was even difficult to get diesel delivered to the island. And they have made news several times in the past. They have been featured on BBC and other places, and I think that's where I first came across this story, was on a BBC story from like 2017. And I put it in that future topics list. And I was like, one of these days, man, I'm going to figure out a way to get myself to Scotland, and I want to go interview these people and do a show about that. And so I finally pulled that off this last fall. That was one that was high on my list of things that I really wanted to do someday. And so yeah, I went there. I spent a week there. I did 5 interviews there and turned that into an episode. And I'm really enjoyed that opportunity. Just lovely people, fascinating place, great experience, super interesting. So the cool thing about Egg was they made their own grid. They did their own little energy transition using wind and hydro and solar. And those 3 renewable resources right there on their island provide over 90%, I think it's like 95% of the power they consume on an annual basis. They made it all happen themselves. They went out and they got grant money and they self-funded it, and they got donations and they hired expertise, and they just made it happen, and they built their own little island grid. And I thought, if 115 people living on a tiny island on the North Atlantic off the coast of Scotland can do an energy transition with their own resources, then who can't do it, right? And so that to me was a very inspirational story, and one that I was really eager to tell.
Chris, I'd like to ask maybe get a little bit more about your background. I mentioned in the intro that you have shared with me that you've had 7 careers. You've worked for, I'll let you tell the number of companies. Could you tell us a little bit about, and work your way into it, but where did you grow up, and was there anything particularly specific about your childhood that would have suggested the direction that you went in your career, maybe entrepreneurship, mentors in your youth, et cetera?
Well, I pretty much grew up in Tucson, Arizona. I don't think there was anything in my upbringing or my, context there in Tucson that particularly led me into a career in energy. My father was an entrepreneur several times over. The majority of his career was as an insurance agent, but he had his own business. And we often talked a lot around the dinner table about some of his business ideas or his investment ideas. And so there was certainly that element where, my father as a role model and an inspiration sparked in me an interest in being an entrepreneur and in having my own business, for sure. As a child, I tagged along with him to some of the, business related things that he was doing in his several careers as well. But yeah, I don't know that growing up in Tucson really had much at all to do with winding up in the energy field. I went to college in the mid 80s, right? And so this was long before concerns about sustainability really were anywhere near the mainstream. Nobody was talking about climate change. Energy wasn't really a field unless you were going to go into the oil business. If you wanted to study anything related to energy, you would have probably taken a geology degree and gone to work for an oil company. I mean, that was kind of like the only thing. Solar didn't really exist as far as anybody knew. Wind wasn't a thing, particularly. So I spent my career the first several decades of it anyway, I felt like I was constantly in search of something that qualifies what would be for me the quote unquote right livelihood, right? Like that career opportunity that um, met my objectives as a person, that used my talents, my particular interests, and was ultimately satisfying. And for me, satisfaction was largely about doing work that mattered to me. You know, just making money wasn't enough. I always wanted to do work that really mattered. I wanted my career to matter to me on some non-monetary level. I wanted to feel like I was doing something important, something that mattered to humanity. And yeah, I went through 7 different careers on the way to the podcast. I've literally worked at over 100 companies. There was some years there when I was, working as a temp, and I was working all over the place. I was ahead of the curve in multiple instances. I started an internet publishing business in 1994. When
Wow.
all that really existed as far as the internet goes, and as far as most people knew, was like CompuServe and America Online. Like the actual internet, most people didn't know about it yet. In fact, I remember our first set of marketing literature. I actually created a print marketing brochure, printed on recyclable paper, mind you, which explained what a website was and why you might want to hire us to make one for you, and what the internet was. So I was a little early to the internet. I was early to um, online publishing about this stuff. We created an online magazine back then called Better World. I was the original registrar of betterworld.com. Of course, back then, I could have bought any domain name at all because
Right.
nobody knew what it was. And in fact, ultimately, I think I made more money from selling the domain names we bought for our business than I ever did through the actual business that we tried to do. But yeah, back then I wanted to create the world's first online magazine about sustainability and corporate responsibility, and pair that with an online mall. So you could go to the magazine and read articles about sustainability, and then you could go over to the other side of the website and buy products from Tom's of Maine. We created the first website for Tom's of Maine, for American Hemp Mercantile, and a few other of our very first early clients. We built their first websites. And so that was an idea that was only 20 years too early. It was a failure as a business, obviously. If I had just done what the business opportunity was at the time, which was make a website for anybody who will pay you to make a website, we could have made a real business out of it. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to do something that mattered. I wanted to work, do work that was aligned with my values and that pursued this concept of sustainability and corporate responsibility and socially responsible investing and all the other things that we covered in the magazine. And so, we were one of the first magazines related to sort of green, what we would call green content today on the internet. And so, yeah, then I got into the solar business in 2004.
Hmm.
Again, a little bit early. Back
Was this as
then,
an entrepreneur?
well, I was independently employed, but I was working with a little co-op that was doing solar projects, residential and commercial solar projects.
Mm.
But I had to, do it all myself. It was very primitive back then. I had to
Yeah.
go find my clients and go do the site visit. And back then, that meant actually carrying all the gear that I needed to do everything related to a site visit. So I would get up on the roof and actually get out my measuring tape and measure the whole roof and make a drawing on graph paper, and then get out my little solar pathfinder, which is a device probably nobody even
Hmm.
knows what it is anymore.
I do. I owned one.
And make a little, crayon drawing of the shading profile, and then take all that stuff back home and turn it into an actual CAD drawing and do all the calculations and figure out what the actual production could be, and then design the system and lay it all out right down to the last nut and bolt of every single attachment. And then, figure it all out in terms of the cost and the energy production, and then decide if we're going to try to switch them to a different utility rate in order to improve the economics, and then do a 30-year cash flow model. And then if I actually sold the job, then I would have to go do all the paperwork with PG&E, which is primarily the utility territory I was working in. And, all the things involved in getting the interconnections, and then the rebate from the California Energy Commission, and so on and so forth. And so it was all, very manual. So, I started in the internet business before anybody knew what it was. I started in the solar business before very many people knew what it was. The solar business itself turned out to be very difficult to make a living in when I was in it, in that sort of 2004, 2005 timeframe. Because at that time, Germany's solar feed-in tariff was so hot that it was sucking about half of the world's supply of modules to Germany. And we couldn't get equipment to finish our jobs. And I was spending more and more of my time fielding angry calls from my customers going, hey, I gave you, a deposit for my solar system 6 months ago. Where is it? And I just kept having to say, well, I'm trying to get you modules. I really am. We're trying so hard. And that sucked. It was hard to make a living that way. So then I switched to writing for a newsletter publisher about energy-related themes and energy and investing. And that kind of sent me off down that path of becoming an energy analyst and a writer on energy topics. And that led me through a number of freelance gigs. I wrote for a publication that no longer exists called Smart Planet. I wrote for, Scientific American and National Geographic, and I got a few things published in Nature and so on. So I did okay as an independent energy journalist, a freelance energy journalist. But it was still very difficult to make a living. So then I switched to, I worked for a company called Global Footprint Network that does data on sustainability, and then eventually found myself over at Rocky Mountain Institute in Denver area in Boulder, Colorado. And so and it coincidentally happened that we launched the podcast the same week that I started at RMI.
I always wondered what the sequence was there.
Well, Justin and I had been developing the podcast for, 6 to 9 months before RMI hired me. And so it was just kind of coincident. Like, we had the first shows in the can. Basically, we built the podcast in my nights and weekends while I was working at RMI, until it got to the point where it could support me full time. And then I just switched over to working on the podcast full time. So yeah, that's the broad arc of my career.
I so identify with the nights and weekends. I said in a recent episode, I think, I was interviewed somewhere else, and I basically said I built the show between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.
Yeah.
on any given day, honestly. So I appreciate the hustle there. Well, I mentioned in the outset, you have done over 200 episodes. You've mentioned as many as, I think, 219. There's one that I think would be on any listener's must listen, episode number 1, because it's a full episode, 90 minutes. And so I'll point to that one, episode number 211, Doomers versus Transitionistas. Maybe at some point I'll have you back on. We'll just go deep on that topic alone. But are there any other that you would consider sort of the canon, that playlist for newbies that you would consider must listen episodes?
I love all my children equally.
Choose your favorites.
But what a new listener could do is go to our website, and we've got all sorts of tools in the search bar that will help them select or filter or sort shows. So they can actually sort through our whole catalog by geek rating, for example, to find shows that are at their level. They can sort all of our shows by what's trending, or by the most popular shows, or by topic, and so on. So there's all sorts of different ways to find your way through our catalog, depending on who you are and what you're interested in. If you just want to find shows about solar, you can just go to the solar topic and do that. We did produce early on a series of shows called the Energy Basics, to just sort of explain to people what the basics of energy are. You know, what is energy? How does it work? How does the grid work? What is electricity? And that kind of thing. And so we did a whole series of little modules, which walk people through that. And those continue to be some of our most popular shows, for people, especially, I think, who are just trying to get up to speed on energy. But I've actually even had people who have been working in the industry for years who told me that they still find those energy basic shows useful to help them sort of fill in the missing spots in their own knowledge base. So,
I'm going to go back and find them because I don't think I've listened to those episodes. I'll find them and then we'll link to them in the show notes.
yeah.
Who do you think is the underdog right now in the energy transition?
Well, I mean, I think that VPPs and other sorts of DER coordinated assets are still very nascent as a technology, potentially very powerful, and could be a very large part of what makes the 100% or nearly 100% renewable grid work. So I would point to DERs and to VPPs and other ways of using DERs, just even simple demand response programs and that kind of thing. And then on the supply side, what I think about is geothermal. I've always loved geothermal. It's such an interesting and potentially very powerful and useful source of energy for us, but it's had a lot of challenges in getting to commercial scale, and I think there are some new players that are using new techniques, largely borrowed from the oil and gas industry, that could actually unlock the power of geothermal in a way that it hasn't been before. So I'm bullish on that.
Yeah, I think the thing that excites me the most about geothermal is that it is the closest cousin to fossil technology wise. So it provides the easiest. You know, a lot of folks talk about hydrogen, but it provides the easiest segue transition for the scientists that understand subsurface conditions and drilling for resources of any of the energy transition opportunities. I guess similarly, I might call this the Joe Namath of the energy transition. Who do you think is the most overrated tech or topic?
Well, it'd be a toss-up between CCS and nukes.
Okay, I love that answer. All right, CCS, which is for those who are unfamiliar,
Carbon capture and sequestration. I mean,
the other darling of the oil and gas industry.
We've been hearing all sorts of wild claims about the role that CCS and nukes are going to play in the energy system of the future for literally decades. And
yeah,
basically, neither one of them exist at a commercial scale. Talking about SMRs in the nuclear case. Still, after all these decades of hype. Yeah, very overrated.
A few more quick questions, just to dig into kind of the way you see the world. Who, when you think about folks that influence you, you are an influencer of influencers. Who influences you? Who do you feel is impressive, and why do you characterize them thus?
I guess the simple way to answer that question is just look at who I keep inviting back on my show.
The recurring guests.
Yeah. Lorenzo Christov is the first name that comes to mind for me. He was an architect of the California wholesale market system, the CAISO, and he's been championing DERs and DER coordination and VPPs and that kind of thing for a long time. And he's very much champion of the just transition as well. So he's a person with great expertise, deep knowledge. He's a terrific communicator, and I think he's really been pushing the envelope for the energy transition in a lot of ways.
When you're not thinking about energy transition, what do you nerd out about?
Gosh, everything. I mean, I'm constantly, like, I'm pretty much on a daily basis, I'm reading. I'm reading stuff that I hoping to find something that I don't know, or hoping to find a hot new topic, right? And so I'm regularly diving into technical papers. I mean, one of the uh, well, I guess my first real, what I would consider my first real career was as a technical writer. And in that job, which I did for about 10 years, um, you have to be willing to open up a technical document about a topic you know nothing about, and make sense of it and edit it and make the language clear, make the concepts clear, and just be able to get your head around technical material that you know that you have no background in. And 10 years of practice in that enabled me to do a lot of what I do now. So, I can now pick up a technical document on, you know, balancing an RTO or whatever. And even if I don't have the technical background to understand it, I can understand it enough. And I can also whip through a big pile of complicated technical documents and figure out what matters enough to write an interview around it in a couple of hours, usually now. And so I am always, always, always plowing through all sorts of technical documents and reading about all sorts of stuff that may or may not ever show up on the podcast, but it contributes to my own knowledge base.
Well, for those who are ritualistically looking for ways to expand their mind and their exercise is learning more about the energy transition, I recommend that they do listen to your podcast. You can direct them to your website. How can you best be found?
Well, the website is energytransitionshow.com. And of course, you can find it on your favorite podcast player or whatever. Because we are a subscription show, there are certain walled garden proprietary podcast players like Spotify that do not let you access our subscription feed because they want to own and control everything. They don't play nice with public podcasts. But any other regular podcast player like Apple Podcasts, or my favorite player is Pocket Casts, we'll let you access our full subscription feed.
Big fan of Pocket Casts over here. I hope that everyone has been able to, I would say, nourish themselves with this conversation, because I have long wanted a chance to really dig into the man behind the mic, the guy who helped create what I consider to be one of the leading podcasts on the clean energy transition and on climate tech in general. Chris, I'm super honored to have you on SunCast. I hope that it's not the last time.
Well, I'm super honored that you were interested, and thank you for the opportunity to, share my story with your listeners. And congratulations on your show as well, because I think you are doing an important service, and you are, you are providing important information to a large audience, much larger than ours, I'm sure, and reaching people that we would never reach. And I think, it takes all of us to make this energy transition work. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners for a minute.
We'll look forward to seeing you back on the show. It does indeed take all of us. Thank you for that nod, my friend. And we'll see you again soon.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
It's not every day I have an opportunity to sit with someone that I see running alongside and where there's mutual respect and admiration for the work that we do that is so very similar in nature, at least. I certainly have a chance to sit often with folks that I admire, respect, and look up to, as I believe Chris would say he does with his guests. So it's fun when I get to sit down with a fellow clean energy transition, solar warrior, to chop it up and discuss how it all comes together and how it works. Chris and I probably could have had longer conversations about our musings and thoughts on the industry. If that's something that you would like to hear us engage in, please let us know. I have at least suggested to Chris from time to time it would be fun to do additional collaboration together. So if that'd be fun for you all and you'd like to hear more, shoot us an email. Let us know. Comment on the LinkedIn post that no doubt I, at least, and possibly Chris as well, will have posted about this episode. Chris, thank you for giving of your time. And thank you, dear listener and viewer, for taking time out of your busy, busy schedule We both hope that we're influencing the influencers, that we're giving you the tools that you need on the front lines of this clean energy transition. If you'd like to know more about all of the ways that I dug in and researched the backstory for Chris, the episodes that he mentioned, if you're looking for a link to that book by Alan Watts, well, I will link to it in our show notes. That's at mysuncast.com. Of course, you, my fellow philomath, can find that and all the other various ways to connect with us over at mysuncast.com. And I hope that you will connect with us on LinkedIn, because I like to be found at least on LinkedIn. I know that Chris is more oft than not on Mastodon, so we'll link to all of those goodies as well. I want to thank our sponsors who help make this show possible each and every week by putting forth the money. All you got to do is pay attention. They help support this show so that I don't have to ask for subscribers. I would love it if you would subscribe to the show, however. Just give us a rating and review if you're there, by the way. But subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on the twice weekly content that we publish to help you on your journey. And give a nod to those sponsors who help us by checking out the offers that they have for you. We've mentioned them here in the episode, but you can find them at mysuncast.com/sponsor. Of course, that's also how you can figure out ways to work with us to reach thousands of solar warriors and climate champions each and every week, just like they do. We'll be back again next week, as always, with a practical, tactical episode on Tuesday and a long-form, insightful executive profile, just like the one you've heard today on Thursday. And maybe occasionally we'll throw in a smattering of our live content or some other episodes from our Resource Labs network. For now, remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up, Solar Warrior. It's half the battle.